Jiwoo stepped off the transport ship and looked around Nexus Station. The massive space station stretched in all directions, with beings she had never seen before walking past her. Some had 4 arms, others had wings, and a few looked like walking crystals. She pulled her single bag closer and followed the signs toward the Galactic Academy. The Academy building was huge, made of some kind of metal that changed colors as she walked. Students filled the hallways, talking in languages that sounded like music, clicking sounds, or electronic beeps. Jiwoo kept her head down and looked for her room assignment. "You must be the human," said a voice behind her. Jiwoo turned around to see a tall being made of what looked like purple crystal. Light moved through its body like water. "I am Crix. We share living space." Jiwoo bowed slightly. "Hello. I am Jiwoo. Thank you for welcoming me." Crix tilted its head. The movement made small bell sounds. "You are very polite. Most new students are loud and excited. Come, I will show you our room." The dormitory room was small but clean. 2 beds sat on opposite sides, with a desk for each student. Crix's side was covered with crystal formations that glowed softly. Jiwoo placed her bag on the empty bed and began unpacking her few belongings. "You do not have many things," Crix observed. "I only brought what I needed," Jiwoo replied. She placed her notebooks and writing tools on the desk. Everything was simple and organized. Crix watched her with interest. "Tell me about your world. Earth is classified as a Class 12 Deathworld, yes? Most beings are afraid to even think about such places." Jiwoo paused while folding her clothes. "Earth can be dangerous, but it is home. We learn to live with the dangers. But how do you survive?" "I have read reports. Your world has predators that hunt in packs, plants that poison the air, and weather that can kill in minutes. Even your smallest life forms can cause death." Jiwoo smiled softly. "We adapt, we learn, we find ways to live safely." Crix made a humming sound. "You are the 3rd human ever accepted to this academy. The other 2 left after 1 semester. Students here come from the safest, most advanced worlds in the galaxy. They do not understand Deathworld beings." "I am here to learn," Jiwoo said simply. "I will do my best." The next morning, Jiwoo attended her first class. Advanced xenobiology was held in a large room with students from many different species. She found a seat in the back and took out her notebook. Professor Thane entered the room. He was tall and insect-like, with 4 arms and compound eyes that seemed to look everywhere at once. His voice was deep and carried authority. "Welcome to Advanced Xenobiology," Professor Thane announced. "This semester, you will study survival adaptations across extreme environments. You will work in groups to research how different species survive in hostile conditions." Jiwoo listened carefully and took notes. Around her, other students whispered to each other in their various languages. She understood some of the common galactic languages, but focused on the professor's words. "Your groups have been assigned," Professor Thane continued. He began reading names from a list. Group 7, Vex of Helios Prime, Quinn of the Aquatic Reaches, Zeta of the Synthetic Collective, and Jiwoo of Earth. A tall being with golden skin and wing-like membranes attached to his arms turned to look at Jiwoo. His eyes were bright blue and seemed to glow slightly. This was Vex. He looked at her for a long moment, then turned back to face the professor without saying anything. After class, Jiwoo gathered her things and approached her group members. Quinn was a small being with smooth gray skin and large eyes that never seemed to blink. Zeta looked like a human made of metal and wires with glowing panels where a face should be. "So," Vex said, his voice smooth and confident, "we have been given the primitive as a group member." Quinn made a nervous chirping sound. "Perhaps we should introduce ourselves properly? I am Vex, heir to the Helios trading empire. My family controls commerce across 12 star systems. I am here because I earned the highest scores in xenobiology. On my world." He looked directly at Jiwoo. "I assume you are here due to some kind of diversity program for underdeveloped species?" Zeta's panels flickered. Academic records indicate Jiwoo scored in the 99th percentile on all entrance examinations. Her presence suggests merit-based admission. Vex waved a hand dismissively. "Test scores can be adjusted for cultural differences. Everyone knows Deathworld species think differently. More primitive." Jiwoo said nothing. She simply took out her notebook and opened it to a fresh page. "What topic would you like to research for our project?" "We will decide that among the qualified members," Vex replied. "You can take notes." Over the following days, Jiwoo attended all her classes and listened carefully to every lecture. She took detailed notes and asked questions only when directly addressed by professors. Her group met twice a week to work on their project. But Vex always scheduled meetings when Jiwoo was in other classes. "I tried to contact you about the meeting yesterday," Vex would say when she asked about the project. "Perhaps Deathworld. Communication systems are not compatible with standard galactic networks." Jiwoo knew this was not true. Her communication device worked perfectly, but she only nodded and asked if she could help with any remaining work. Crix noticed her roommate's quiet behavior. "You never speak about your group project. How is the work progressing?" "It is progressing," Jiwoo replied. She was reading a book about Helion physiology from the library. "That is not an answer." "Are they treating you fairly?" Jiwoo looked up from her book. "I am learning much about different species. That is why I came here." "Learning is good, but you should also be participating. You are as qualified as any student here." Jiwoo smiled. "I am participating, just not in the way they expect." Crix's crystal body pulsed with concern. "You should report problems to the professors. The Academy has rules about group cooperation." "There are no problems," Jiwoo said gently. "Everything is exactly as it should be." She returned to her book. The section on Helion skeletal structure was particularly interesting. Their bones were hollow like birds, making them lighter but also more fragile. She made careful notes in the margins. In the following weeks, Jiwoo established a routine. She attended every class, completed all individual assignments, and spent hours in the library researching topics that interested her. Other students began to notice the quiet human who never spoke, unless spoken to, and never caused any trouble. Some students felt sorry for her. Others found her presence amusing. A few wondered why someone from a death world was so passive and gentle. On Earth, they thought, she would have been eaten by predators long ago. Jiwoo heard these whispers but paid them no attention. She was busy learning about the 47 different species represented at the Academy. Each had unique strengths, weaknesses, social structures, and survival mechanisms. She found it all fascinating. Her notebooks filled with observations about behavior, patterns, physical capabilities, and cultural hierarchies. She noted which species formed alliances, which avoided conflict, and which used intimidation to maintain social status. Professor Thane occasionally called on her during lectures. Her answers were always correct and showed deep understanding of the material. He began to look at her with something that might have been respect. "The human shows promise," he mentioned to another professor after class one day. "Quiet, but intelligent." Ji-woo continued her studies, unaware that her quiet presence had begun to create ripples in the social structure of the academy. Change was coming, but it would start slowly, like most dangerous things from Deathworlds. Vex stood at the center of the student common area, surrounded by his usual group of followers. His golden skin caught the artificial sunlight from the station's lighting system, making him look like a statue of some ancient hero. He spoke loudly, enough for everyone to hear. "I cannot understand why the Academy lowered its standards," he said, gesturing with his wing membranes for emphasis. "Accepting students from primitive worlds makes no sense. This is supposed to be an elite institution." Several students nodded in agreement. A few looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Speaking against Vex meant making an enemy of one of the most powerful families in the Helios system. Ji-woo sat at a corner table, eating her lunch and reading a book about comparative anatomy. She heard Vex's words, but continued reading. The chapter on nerve clusters in different species was particularly interesting. "Take our group project, for example," Vex continued. "We have been forced to work with someone who clearly does not belong here. The human sits in meetings and says nothing. No ideas, no contributions, just staring with those primitive eyes." Quinn, the small aquatic being, shifted nervously at a nearby table. "Perhaps she is shy? Some species need time to adjust to new social environments." Vex laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm. "Shy? No. This is what happens when unqualified beings are admitted for political reasons. They cannot keep up with real academic work." Zeta, the synthetic being, approached Vex's table. Its metallic body moved with perfect precision. "Academic records suggest otherwise. Human Ji-woo has scored perfectly on all individual assignments." "Individual assignments," Vex repeated with contempt. "Anyone can memorize facts. Real intelligence shows in group work, in leadership, in the ability to contribute original ideas. The human has shown none of these qualities." Ji-woo turned a page in her book. The section on pressure points was fascinating. Different species had completely different vulnerable areas. She made a small note in the margin. Over the following days, Vex began testing boundaries. During their next group meeting, he deliberately chose a time when Ji-woo was in her advanced physics class. When she asked about what she had missed, he shrugged. "We discussed basic concepts. Nothing you would understand anyway." In advanced xenobiology class, Vex began sitting directly behind Ji-woo. Whenever she took out her notebooks, he would accidentally knock them off her desk with his wing. The first time it happened, Ji-woo simply picked up her materials and continued taking notes. "Sorry," Vex said with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Hellions need space for our wings. Perhaps you should sit somewhere more suitable for smaller species." Ji-woo moved to a different seat. When Vex knocked her things down again the next day, she moved again. Other students began to notice the pattern, but no one said anything. Professor Thane observed these interactions but did not interfere. Academic politics were complicated, and the Helios family donated significant funds to the academy. Unless there was clear violation of rules, professors were expected to let students work out their own social problems. After 2 weeks of this behavior, Vex grew bolder. During a practical laboratory session, students were required to calibrate sensitive equipment for measuring biological responses. Ji-woo arrived early and began setting up her workstation carefully. Vex arrived with his friends and took the station next to hers. While she was focused on her calibrations, he reached over and adjusted several of her settings. The changes were subtle, but would make her equipment give false readings. When it came time for presentations, Jiwoo's equipment malfunctioned. Her readings were completely wrong, making her analysis look foolish. Professor Thane frowned at her results. "This is disappointing, Jiwoo. I expected better preparation from you." "I apologize, Professor. May I repeat the assignment during my own time?" "You may, but this will affect your participation grade," Vex whispered to his friends, loud enough for others to hear. "See? When real skill is required, the primitive fails. Book learning is not the same as practical ability." After class, Jiwoo returned to the laboratory alone. She examined her equipment carefully and found the adjusted settings. She made note of exactly what had been changed and how. Then she recalibrated everything and repeated the entire assignment. Her second attempt was perfect. Professor Thane reviewed her results with surprise. "Much better. What happened the first time?" "I made errors in calibration. I have learned from them." Professor Thane nodded, but he looked thoughtful. In his 40 years of teaching, he had never seen equipment fail in exactly that way from simple calibration errors. Word of the laboratory incident spread through the academy. Students began to see Jiwoo as entertainment. They made bets on how long she would last before dropping out or having what they called a primitive emotional breakdown. 5 credits says she cries during the next group presentation, said a student from the crystalline hegemony. 10 credits says she tries to physically attack someone, countered a gaseous collective representative. 20 credits says she just disappears one night and goes back to her deathworld, added a member of the hive mind species. Jiwoo heard these conversations, but showed no reaction. She continued attending all her classes, completing all her assignments, and spending long hours in the library. Her research had expanded beyond the required coursework. She was now studying behavioral psychology, social hierarchies, and conflict resolution across multiple species. Crix grew more concerned about her roommate's situation. "You know they are treating you unfairly. Why do you not defend yourself?" Jiwoo looked up from her notes on Helian social structures. "Defend myself from what?" "From their cruelty. From their attempts to make you fail." "I am not failing. My grades are excellent. That is not what I mean, and you know it. They are trying to hurt your spirit, to make you give up." Jiwoo smiled gently. "My spirit is fine. I am learning exactly what I came here to learn, which is how different species behave when they think they have power over others." Crix's crystal body pulsed with confusion. "That is not xenobiology. It is a kind of biology. The study of how beings interact, how they establish dominance, how they test boundaries. Very useful information." "You sound like you are studying them for some purpose." Jiwoo returned to her notes. "I am studying everyone for the same purpose: understanding." The harassment continued to escalate. Vex began accidentally bumping into Jiwoo in hallways, causing her to drop her books. He would then apologize loudly, making sure everyone saw his politeness toward the clumsy human. During group study sessions in the library, he would speak over her whenever she tried to contribute ideas. If she suggested a research direction, he would immediately dismiss it as too primitive or not sophisticated enough for galactic standards. Other students began copying Vex's behavior. They would fall silent when Jiwoo entered a room, then resume talking when she passed. They made jokes about Deathworld intelligence and wondered aloud how someone from such a backwards planet had gotten into the academy. Through it all, Ji-woo remained calm and quiet. She took notes on everything, not just academic subjects, but on social patterns, individual personalities, and group dynamics. Her notebooks filled with observations about who followed whom, who made decisions, and who could be influenced by peer pressure. She learned that Vex's confidence came from his family's wealth and political connections, not from personal achievement. She observed that Quinn desperately wanted to fit in with the popular students, but was too nervous to actively participate in bullying. She noted that Zeta analyzed everything but took no emotional investment in social conflicts. Most importantly, she began to understand the unspoken rules that governed Academy social life. Strength was measured by family status and species reputation. Conflict was avoided through subtle intimidation rather than direct confrontation. And everyone was afraid of being labeled as different or problematic. Ji-woo found these rules fascinating. On Earth, social hierarchies were simpler and more honest. Predators were predators, prey was prey, and everyone knew exactly where they stood. Here, the hierarchy was hidden behind politeness and social conventions. As the weeks passed, she began to see patterns that others missed. She could predict which students would support Vex, which would remain neutral, and which were secretly uncomfortable with his behavior, but too afraid to speak up. Her understanding grew deeper with each passing day. Soon, she would need to decide how to use this knowledge. But for now, she continued to sit quietly, take notes, and let others think they understood her. The real lesson was just beginning. The rumors about Ji-woo spread through the academy like a virus. Students who had never spoken to her began telling stories about the broken human who let everyone walk over her. The stories grew bigger with each telling. I heard she cries in the bathroom after every class, whispered a student from the Feline Coalition. My friend saw her eating alone every day for 2 months, added someone from the Avian Republic. She never fights back, never argues, never even raises her voice. It is like she has no spirit left. These conversations happened everywhere. In dining halls, dormitories, study rooms, and exercise facilities. Ji-woo heard most of them, but her expression never changed. She continued her daily routine with the same quiet determination. The betting pool about her breakdown had grown to over 500 credits. Students from all species contributed, making predictions about when and how the human would finally crack under pressure. In advanced xenobiology class, Professor Thane announced their mid-semester field trip. You will visit the hostile environment, training facility on Deck 47. This station simulates dangerous conditions from various worlds to help you understand adaptation mechanisms. Vex turned to smile at Ji-woo. Perfect. Finally, something the Deathworld primitive might actually understand. The training facility was a massive complex with dozens of different environmental chambers. Each chamber replicated conditions from different types of dangerous worlds: ice planets, desert worlds, high radiation environments, and toxic atmospheres. Professor Thane divided the class into small groups. You will spend 4 hours in assigned environments, observing how different atmospheric conditions affect biological sensors. Record everything you observe. Ji-woo's group was assigned to Chamber 15, which simulated the environment of a high-gravity jungle world. The chamber contained dense vegetation, high humidity, and gravity set to 150% of galactic standard. This should be easy for our Deathworld expert, Vex said as they entered the chamber. The increased gravity immediately made everyone move more slowly. Sweat began forming on most students' faces within minutes. Ji-woo moved normally, as if the gravity change meant nothing to her. Earth's gravity was actually higher than the chamber's simulation. She began taking readings from the biological sensors with steady hands. Vex struggled more than he expected. Helions evolved on a low-gravity world, and the extra weight made his movements clumsy. His wing membranes, designed for gliding in thin atmosphere, became heavy burdens in the thick, humid air. "These conditions are unrealistic," he complained, wiping sweat from his golden skin. "No intelligent species would evolve in such an environment." "Many species adapt to challenging conditions," Ji-woo said quietly, continuing her work with the sensors. "Adapt, maybe, but not evolve intelligence. Intelligence requires comfort, safety, resources for brain development. Primitive worlds produce primitive minds." Ji-woo finished calibrating her equipment and began recording atmospheric readings. Her movements were efficient and calm, showing no signs of stress from the environment. After an hour, Vex began showing clear signs of exhaustion. His breathing was labored, and his usually perfect posture had become slouched. Quinn was uneven. Worse condition, struggling to move at all in the heavy gravity. "Let us take a break," Vex suggested. "The assignment requires 4 hours of continuous observation," Ji-woo replied. She was taking detailed notes, completely comfortable in conditions that were wearing down her classmates. Rules can be flexible when conditions are unreasonable. Prefer to complete assignments as instructed. Vex's frustration was growing. Here was a being he considered inferior, handling conditions that challenged him. Worse, she was doing it without any sign of effort or pride. She just worked steadily, as if difficult environments were normal. During the second hour, Vex made his move. While Ji-woo was focused on a complex sensor reading near the far wall of the chamber, he quietly modified the environmental controls. He increased the humidity to maximum levels and activated a low-level toxic gas simulation. The changes were subtle but dangerous. In the thick jungle atmosphere, the toxic gas would be hard to detect until someone was already affected by it. Most species would become disoriented and confused, making them easy to separate from the main group. Vex then created a distraction, claiming he had found interesting readings near the chamber entrance. He led Quinn and the other group members toward the front of the chamber, leaving Ji-woo alone near the back wall. "Come, human," he called. "You should see these formations." "I will finish this reading first," Ji-woo replied, not looking up from her work. "The group stays together. Academy safety rules. I can see you from here. I will join you in 5 minutes." Vex smiled to himself. The toxic gas would begin affecting her soon. In her confused state, she would become lost in the dense vegetation. By the time they found her, she would be clearly unable to handle basic environmental challenges. He guided the others through a maze of artificial vegetation toward the chamber exit, making several turns that would be difficult to retrace. After 10 minutes, he stopped and looked around with fake concern. "Where is the human? She was supposed to follow us." Quinn made nervous clicking sounds. "Should we go back for her?" "Of course, though I worry she may have become disoriented." Deathworld. Species sometimes panic in unfamiliar environments. They spent another 20 minutes searching the chamber, calling Ji-woo's name. The toxic gas levels were now high enough that most species would be unconscious. When they finally returned to where they had left her, she was gone. Vex immediately activated the emergency communication system. "Professor Thane, we have a problem. The human became separated from our group. She may be lost in the chamber. Professor Thane's voice crackled through the speakers. All students exit immediately. Emergency protocols are now active. Vex led his group out of the chamber, making sure to look worried and concerned. Other students gathered as Academy security, began searching the chamber with full environmental suits and tracking equipment. "How did she get lost?" asked a student from the crystalline hegemony. "The conditions were very challenging," Vex explained sadly. "High gravity, thick atmosphere, limited visibility. She seemed confused and disoriented. We tried to keep the group together, but she insisted on working alone." Security teams searched for 2 hours. The chamber was vast, with multiple levels and dense vegetation that blocked most scanning equipment. Professor Thane looked increasingly worried. "Toxic. Gas levels are dangerous now," reported the security chief. "If she is still in there, she may be unconscious or worse." Just as Professor Thane was about to declare a full emergency evacuation of the station, Jiwoo walked calmly out of Chamber 15. She carried her equipment bag in one hand and a complete set of atmospheric readings in the other. She looked around at the crowd of students, security personnel, and academy staff with mild surprise. "Is there a problem?" Professor Thane stared at her. "Where have you been? We have been searching for you for over 2 hours." "I was completing the assignment. The atmospheric readings required sampling from multiple locations within the chamber. I collected data from 7 different zones." She handed him her report. The toxic gas concentrations were particularly interesting. They varied significantly based on elevation and vegetation density. Toxic gas? The chamber sensors showed dangerous levels. "How are you not affected?" Ji-woo looked puzzled. "Dangerous? The concentrations were well below lethal limits. On Earth, we call this mildly polluted air. Our cities often have higher toxin levels during certain weather conditions." Vex stepped forward, his face showing shock. "But the gravity, the humidity, the complex navigation—" The gravity was lighter than Earth standard. The humidity was comfortable. As for navigation, Jiwoo pulled out a hand-drawn map showing the chamber's complete layout, including areas the security teams had not been able to reach. "I explored the entire facility while collecting samples." The crowd fell silent. Students who had been making jokes about the lost primitive suddenly realized they were looking at someone who had spent 2 hours in conditions that required emergency suits, treated it as a casual walk, and produced work that was more complete than any of them could have managed. Professor Thane examined her readings with growing amazement. "These are extraordinarily detailed. You mapped atmospheric variations that our instruments barely detected. The patterns were clear once you learned to read them. Earth's atmosphere changes constantly due to weather, volcanic activity, and seasonal variations. This chamber was quite stable by comparison." Vex felt a cold fear growing in his chest. His plan had not just failed, it had revealed something about Jiwoo that changed everything. She was not struggling to survive at the academy. She was coasting through challenges that pushed other students to their limits. That night, Crix found Jiwoo sitting quietly in their room, reading a book about atmospheric chemistry. "The entire academy is talking about what happened today," Crix said. "What happened today?" "You disappeared for 2 hours in a dangerous environment and came back unharmed. Some students are saying you are tougher than anyone realized." Jiwoo looked up from her book. "I just completed an assignment. That environment nearly killed several students from other groups. Security teams needed protection suits to search for you." Vex paced in his private quarters, his wing membranes twitching with agitation. The environmental chamber incident had changed how other students looked at the human. Instead of pity, he now saw curiosity in their eyes. Some even showed what looked like respect. This was unacceptable. He activated his personal communication system and sent a priority message to his father on Helios Prime. The reply came within hours, as always. The Helios family did not ignore their heir's requests. Academic irregularities. His father's voice carried the cold authority that had built a trading empire. Interesting. I will make some inquiries. Over the following days, Vex discovered that Ji-Woo's individual assignment scores were perfect. Not just good, literally perfect. Every test, every analysis, every research project scored maximum points. While their group project suffered from his sabotage and exclusion tactics, her personal academic record was flawless. This information filled him with rage. A primitive Deathworld being was outperforming him, the heir to one of the most powerful families in the galaxy. It was impossible. It was humiliating. It was something that needed to be corrected. Vex began his campaign during the next advanced xenobiology lecture. He raised his hand during Professor Thane's discussion of adaptation mechanisms. Professor, I have a question about academic integrity. The classroom fell silent. Professor Thane's compound eyes focused on Vex with interest. Please elaborate. How does the Academy ensure that students from different cultural backgrounds understand our academic standards? Some species might have different concepts of original work versus borrowed knowledge. Professor Thane's expression remained neutral, but several students shifted uncomfortably. All students receive the same orientation regarding academic honesty. Standards are clearly explained regardless of species or cultural origin. Of course. But what about species that use different types of intelligence? For instance, some beings might rely on instinct or inherited genetic memory rather than learned analysis. Their responses might seem original, but actually be programmed behaviors. Ji-Woo continued taking notes, her expression unchanged. She had heard this type of argument before. The suggestion that her intelligence was somehow less valid because it came from a different type of world. All forms of intelligence are valuable. In xenobiology, Professor Thane replied carefully, we study adaptation mechanisms, which include both learned and instinctive responses. But surely there is a difference between intellectual analysis and survival reflexes? Academic work requires abstract thinking, not just pattern recognition evolved for avoiding predators. The implications were clear to everyone in the classroom. Vex was suggesting that Ji-Woo's perfect scores came from animal-like instincts rather than true intelligence. After class, Vex's whisper campaign began in earnest. He spoke quietly to influential students from major species, always careful to sound concerned rather than accusatory. I worry about the integrity of our group project, he told a delegation from the Synthetic Collective. Some of our research seems to show insights that would be impossible without access to restricted databases. Perhaps this human has connections we are unaware of, he suggested to students from the crystalline hegemony. Deathworld species are known for their aggressive networking methods. I have noticed unusual patterns in her responses, he mentioned to members of the Aquatic Assembly. Almost as if she knows exactly what professors want to hear. It makes me wonder if she has inside information about their testing methods. These conversations were carefully designed. Vex never directly accused Ji-Woo of cheating. He simply raised questions and let others draw their own conclusions. It was a technique he had learned from watching his father manipulate political rivals. The campaign worked. Within a week, Whispered conversations followed Ji-woo through the academy halls. Students who had begun to respect her abilities now looked at her with suspicion. The betting pool changed from predicting her breakdown to wagering on when she would be expelled for academic dishonesty. Vex's father's connections provided the final piece. A formal inquiry was launched into Ji-woo's admission credentials. Her test scores were re-evaluated for cultural bias. Her previous academic records from Earth were reviewed for compatibility with galactic standards. The inquiry found no evidence of cheating or fraud, but the investigation itself became evidence of suspicion. Other students reasoned that the Academy would not investigate unless there were serious doubts about her qualifications. Ji-woo became aware of the campaign when Crix approached her with concern. "They are saying you have unfair advantages," Crix reported. "Some students believe you are accessing information that others cannot obtain." "What kind of information?" "Academic databases, professor notes, previous test questions." "They say no. One could score perfectly on everything without inside knowledge." Ji-woo considered this. "Do they think I am cheating?" "Some do. Others think you are using Deathworld techniques to intimidate professors into giving you good grades." "Intimidate how?" "They say professors are afraid of your potential for violence, so they give you high scores to avoid conflict." Ji-woo almost smiled at this. The idea that her quiet, respectful behavior could be seen as threatening was absurd. But she was beginning to understand how deeply other species feared and misunderstood Deathworld beings. "What do you think?" she asked Crix. "I think you are the most honest being I have ever met. I also think they are afraid of what your success means about their own abilities." The situation reached a crisis point during the final group presentation planning session. Vex had arranged the meeting in a public study area where many students could overhear. He brought printed copies of evidence, statistics showing that Ji-woo's perfect scoring pattern was statistically impossible, and research suggesting that Deathworld beings had unfair cognitive advantages due to their harsh evolutionary environment. "I have tried to be fair," Vex announced to the gathered students. "But I cannot allow our group's reputation to be damaged by association with questionable academic practices." He stood and faced Ji-woo directly. "I am formally requesting that you withdraw from our group project. Your contributions have been minimal, and frankly, the suspicions about your methods are affecting all of our standing in the class." Quinn made distressed noises but said nothing. Zeta observed silently, its optical sensors recording everything. Other students in the study area stopped their own work to watch the confrontation. "I understand your concerns," Ji-woo replied quietly. "What would you like me to do?" Vex had expected argument, denial, or anger. Her calm acceptance caught him off guard, but he pressed forward. "Admit that your scores are artificially inflated, request reassessment of your grades using proper galactic standards, acknowledge that Deathworld educational systems are not equivalent to civilized academic institutions." "And if I do this? Then perhaps we can find a minor role for you in our presentation. Note-taking, data entry, tasks appropriate for your actual skill level." The study area had grown completely quiet. Students from multiple species watched the exchange with fascination. This was better than any entertainment program, a public humiliation of the mysterious human who had somehow infiltrated their elite academy. Ji-woo gathered her materials slowly and methodically. She placed her notebooks in her bag with the same careful precision she used for everything. When she stood, she was calm and composed. "I will consider your request," she said. "Good." The presentation is tomorrow. I will prepare our defense of the project's integrity without your questionable contributions." Ji-woo nodded politely and left the study area. Behind her, excited conversations erupted as students discussed what they had witnessed. Many were already spreading the story throughout the academy. That evening, Professor Thane received a formal complaint from Vex's family, requesting that Ji-woo be removed from the advanced xenobiology program, pending a full investigation of her academic credentials. The complaint included testimonies from several students expressing concerns about unfair advantages and possible security breaches. Professor Thane read the complaint with growing unease. The political pressure was significant. The Helios family's donations funded much of the Academy's research. Other influential families were beginning to ask questions about admission standards and the wisdom of accepting Deathworld students. He made a decision that would change everything. The final group presentations would proceed as scheduled, but each student would be required to defend their individual contributions publicly. If there were questions about academic integrity, they would be resolved in front of the entire class. Ji-woo spent that night in her room, reading quietly while Crix worried aloud about the next day's events. "You should prepare your defense," Crix urged. "Gather evidence of your work. Document your research methods. Show them proof of your abilities." "I have been preparing," Ji-woo replied, turning a page in her book about comparative neuroanatomy. "How? You are just reading." Reading is preparation. Understanding is preparation. Patience is preparation. Patience for what? Ji-woo closed her book and looked at her crystalline roommate. For the moment when patience is no longer enough. The advanced xenobiology auditorium filled quickly that morning. Word had spread through the academy about the confrontation brewing between Vex and the human. Students from all species arrived early to claim the best seats for what promised to be either a public vindication or a spectacular downfall. Professor Thane entered through the main door, his 4 arms carrying evaluation tablets and recording equipment. His compound eyes surveyed the packed auditorium with what might have been concern. In 40 years of teaching, he had never seen this level of student interest in academic presentations. Today's group presentations will include individual defense segments, he announced. Each student will explain their specific contributions and answer questions about their research methods. This is a standard academic practice to ensure proper credit allocation. Vex sat in the front row with his supporters, looking confident and prepared. He had spent the morning reviewing his attack strategy and coordinating with other students who would ask pointed questions about Ji-woo's work. Ji-woo sat alone near the back of her group's section. She carried only a single notebook and a small data tablet. Her expression was calm, almost serene, as if she were attending a peaceful garden ceremony rather than facing potential expulsion. The first 3 groups presented without incident. Their projects were competent but unremarkable, standard analyses of adaptation mechanisms with predictable conclusions. The audiences listened politely and asked routine questions. Then Group 7 was called to present. Vex stood with theatrical confidence, his golden skin gleaming under the auditorium lights. His wing membranes spread slightly, a subtle dominance display that most species recognized as a claim of superior status. Our project examines survival adaptations across extreme environments, he began. We have analyzed 47 different species and their unique mechanisms for handling hostile conditions. His presentation was polished and professional. He discussed atmospheric adaptation in crystalline beings, pressure resistance in aquatic species, and radiation immunity in synthetic organisms. The data was comprehensive and the analysis was sophisticated. However, Vex continued, his voice taking on a regretful tone, I must address concerns about the integrity of some research contributions. Academic honesty requires that I acknowledge irregularities in certain portions of our data collection. A murmur rippled through the auditorium. This was what everyone had come to see. Some of our most detailed analyses seemed to show insights that would be impossible to obtain through standard research methods. The depth of understanding regarding species vulnerabilities and behavioral patterns raises questions about information sources. Professor Thane's expression remained neutral. Are you suggesting academic misconduct within your group? I am suggesting that some contributions may have used non-standard research methods that give unfair advantages. Methods that other students cannot access or replicate. The auditorium buzzed with excited whispers. Students leaned forward in their seats, anticipating the dramatic confrontation to come. Please proceed with individual defenses, Professor Thane instructed. Vex, explain your contributions. Vex outlined his work with practiced ease. He had researched atmospheric adaptation mechanisms, compiled data on gaseous exchange systems, and analyzed respiratory efficiency across 15 different species. His methodology was standard, and his sources were properly cited. Quinn, nervously, explained his research on aquatic adaptations. Zeta provided a detailed analysis of synthetic biological modifications. Both presentations were technically competent and properly documented. Then Professor Thane called Jiwoo to the presentation area. She walked to the front of the auditorium with the same quiet composure she had shown for months. 200 students and faculty members focused their attention on the small human who had somehow become the center of academy controversy. Please explain your contributions to the group project, Professor Thane instructed. Ji-woo placed her notebook on the presentation podium and opened it to the first page. When she began speaking, her voice was clear and steady, carrying easily through the silent auditorium. I researched behavioral adaptation mechanisms across all 47 species represented at this academy. My focus was understanding how different beings respond to stress, conflict, and social pressure. She activated the auditorium's display system and began showing her data. The screen filled with detailed charts, behavioral analysis graphs, and comparative psychology models. Each species has unique social hierarchies and conflict resolution methods. For example, Helians use intimidation displays and economic pressure to establish dominance. They rely on inherited status rather than individual achievement and become aggressive when their authority is questioned. Vex shifted uncomfortably as Ji-woo's analysis continued. Crystalline hegemony members prefer consensus building and avoid direct confrontation. They will support majority positions even when privately disagreeing. Synthetic beings prioritize logical analysis but can be influenced by data presentation methods. Her presentation continued for 20 minutes, revealing an understanding of academy social dynamics that was both comprehensive and startling. She had not just studied academic subjects, she had studied every student, faculty member, and social interaction she had observed. My research methodology involved direct observation, behavioral pattern analysis, and response prediction modeling. I documented 1,247 individual interactions, categorized 89 different social behaviors, and identified 23 distinct hierarchy establishment methods. The auditorium was completely silent. Students began to realize they were looking at data about themselves, their own behaviors, reactions, and social patterns analyzed with scientific precision. For validation, I cross-referenced my observations with established xenopsychology literature. My behavioral predictions showed 94.7% accuracy over a 3-month testing period. Professor Thane leaned forward with interest. You conducted a comprehensive psychological study of the entire Academy population? Yes. The group project required understanding survival adaptations. Social behavior is a survival adaptation. I studied how different species adapt to academic pressure, peer influence, and status competition. She turned to face the auditorium. Directly. I also studied how different species respond to perceived threats to their social position. The results were quite predictable. Vex felt cold fear settling in his chest. She was describing his own behavior as if it were a laboratory. Experiment. Questions? Professor Thane asked. A student from the Avian Republic raised a wing. How did you gather such detailed information without anyone noticing? I observed quietly and took careful notes. Most beings ignore those they consider unimportant. This created ideal conditions for behavioral research. Another student called out, "But you never participated in social activities. How could you understand our behaviors?" Non-participation was part of the research methodology. By remaining neutral, I could observe natural social patterns without influencing outcomes. Vex stood abruptly, his wing membranes spreading in full intimidation display. This is exactly what I warned about. She admits to conducting unauthorized psychological experiments on fellow students. This is a violation of research ethics and probably Academy regulations. The auditorium erupted in confused discussions. Some students felt violated by the revelation that they had been studied. Others were impressed by the sophistication of Jiwoo's research. Professor Thane raised a hand for silence. The methodology appears sound, and behavioral observation is a standard xenobiology research technique. However, I understand concerns about consent and ethical protocols. Vex saw his opportunity. Professor, this confirms everything I have reported. She has been using deceptive methods to gain unfair academic advantages. Her perfect scores are based on manipulating professors and fellow students through psychological techniques. I have manipulated no one, Jiwoo replied calmly. I completed all assignments according to instructions and answered all questions honestly. But you used your observations to predict what professors wanted to hear. I used my observations to understand the subjects being taught. Learning requires understanding. Understanding requires observation. Vex's frustration was building toward rage. Nothing he said seemed to affect her. She answered every accusation with calm logic, making him look increasingly desperate and emotional. You think you are so superior, he snarled. Sitting there with your quiet arrogance, judging everyone, pretending to be harmless while you analyze us like laboratory specimens. I do not think I am superior. I think I am different. Different? You are primitive. Your entire species consists of barely civilized animals who crawled out of a toxic wasteland and somehow learned to use tools. The auditorium fell completely silent. Even Vex's supporters looked uncomfortable with this level of personal attack. Jiwoo remained seated at the presentation podium, her hands folded calmly in front of her. Do you have questions about my research methodology? I have questions about your right to be here at all. Vex's voice was rising to a shout. This academy is for civilized beings, not Deathworld savages who spy on their betters. Time seemed to slow as Vex's hand made contact with Ji-Woo's shoulder. For months, she had endured his harassment with perfect patience. She had absorbed his insults, ignored his sabotage, and remained calm through every escalation. But physical violence crossed a line that changed all calculations. Ji-Woo did not stand up. She did not turn around. She did not raise her voice or show any sign of anger. Her left hand moved exactly 12 centimeters to the right, fingers closing around Vex's wrist with surgical precision. Her grip found the exact pressure point, where 3 major nerves clustered. Near the joint, a vulnerability she had noted weeks ago while studying Helian anatomy in the Academy library. Simultaneously, her right hand moved upward in a motion so small it was almost invisible. Her knuckles struck a specific point on Vex's spine, just below the base of his skull where the vertebrae formed a natural weak point in Helian skeletal structure. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. A sharp crack echoed through the silent auditorium, the sound of cartilage compressing and nerve pathways temporarily disrupting. Vex's body went completely rigid for 1 heartbeat, then collapsed like a marionette with cut strings. He fell forward across the presentation desk, his golden skin suddenly pale, his wing membranes twitching uncontrollably. His eyes were wide and conscious, but his body would not respond to his commands. He could breathe, he could see, he could hear, but he could not move anything below his neck. Ji-Woo calmly adjusted his position so his airway remained clear, then returned to her. Presentation materials as if nothing had happened. As I was saying, she continued in the same quiet voice she had used throughout her academic career, adaptation mechanisms often involve precise application of force at specific anatomical weakness points. The auditorium erupted in chaos. Students screamed, jumped from their seats, or froze in shock. Several beings from prey species triggered involuntary flight responses and bolted for the exits. A few predator species activated their own combat instincts and began looking for threats to fight. Professor Thane's compound eyes focused on the scene with rapid calculations. His security training identified the situation immediately. A threat had been neutralized with minimal force and maximum efficiency. Medical team to Auditorium 7, he announced into his communication device. Student injury, possible spinal trauma. Ji-Woo looked up from her notes with mild concern. No spinal trauma. Temporary nerve disruption at the C3-C4 junction. Full mobility will return in approximately 6 to 8 hours. I calculated the force precisely to avoid permanent damage. A medical team rushed into the auditorium with emergency equipment. They began scanning Vex's body with sophisticated diagnostic tools, expecting to find severe injury. Instead, they found exactly what Ji-Woo had described, a perfectly executed nerve block that would heal completely within hours. "How did you know the exact pressure point?" asked the lead medic, a being from the Healing Collective who specialized in multi-species anatomy. "I studied Helion skeletal and nervous system documentation from the Academy library. Their evolutionary development on low-gravity worlds created predictable structural weaknesses. The information is publicly available in standard xenobiology textbooks." Students throughout the auditorium began backing away from Ji-Woo, their faces showing emotions ranging from terror to awe. They had just witnessed something impossible, a being who could disable a trained predator species without standing up, without weapons, without even looking angry. "You could have killed him," whispered a student from the crystalline hegemony. "Yes," Ji-Woo agreed simply. "But that would have disrupted my education. I came here to learn, not to eliminate fellow students. The casual acknowledgement of lethal capability sent another wave of fear through the crowd. This was not boasting or intimidation. It was a factual statement delivered with the same tone she used to discuss atmospheric pressure readings. Vex tried to speak but could only produce weak sounds. His vocal cords were partially paralyzed along with the rest of his motor functions. Jiwoo knelt beside him and checked his pulse and breathing with professional competence. "You will be fine," she told him gently. "The paralysis is temporary. I specifically chose a technique that causes no permanent damage. You should be able to move normally by evening." Professor Thane approached the presentation area cautiously. In his long career, he had seen many conflicts between students, but nothing approaching this level of swift, calculated violence. "Jiwoo, I need you to explain exactly what happened." Vex initiated physical contact in an aggressive manner. I responded with appropriate defensive measures to neutralize the threat while minimizing harm to all parties. Appropriate defensive measures? Earth's environment requires rapid threat assessment and precise response capabilities. All human children learn basic anatomical vulnerabilities of local predator species for survival purposes. I applied the same principles to Academy species as part of my adaptation strategy. The implications of her words slowly sank in around the auditorium. She had not just studied their social behaviors, she had cataloged their physical weaknesses as well. Every species present was suddenly aware that the quiet human sitting at the presentation desk knew exactly how to disable or kill them if necessary. "You have been studying how to hurt us?" asked Quinn, his voice shaking with fear. "I have been studying how to survive among you," Jiwoo corrected. "Threat analysis is automatic for Deathworld species. We do not choose to notice vulnerabilities. We simply cannot help seeing them. It is how our minds process environmental information." A student from the synthetic collective spoke with electronic precision. "Define Deathworld in this context." Jiwoo considered the question seriously. "Earth is classified as a Class 12 Deathworld because every aspect of the environment actively attempts to kill its inhabitants. Plants produce toxins, animals hunt in coordinated packs, weather systems can become lethal within minutes, and microscopic organisms cause fatal diseases." She gestured around the auditorium. "Most species here evolved on worlds where survival was cooperative. You developed intelligence to share resources and build safe communities. Humans developed intelligence to identify and neutralize threats before they became fatal." "So you see all of us as threats?" Professor Thane asked. "I see all of you as beings with the potential to become threats under certain circumstances. This is not hostility. It is pattern recognition. The same way you automatically notice temperature changes or lighting variations." The medical team carefully moved Vex onto a transport gurney. He would recover fully, but the psychological impact of his defeat would last much longer than his physical paralysis. As they wheeled him out of the auditorium, Jiwoo called after them. "Please monitor his emotional state during recovery. Helions have difficulty processing social defeat. He may require counseling to prevent depression or revenge fixation." Even her concern for his mental health was delivered with clinical detachment, as if she were discussing the care requirements for a laboratory specimen. The auditorium slowly emptied as students filed out in small, nervous groups. They whispered among themselves in dozens of languages, but the topic was universal. How had they so completely misunderstood the nature of their quiet classmate? Professor Thane remained behind with Jiwoo as she packed her presentation materials with the same methodical care she had shown throughout the semester. Will you continue your studies here? He asked. That depends on whether I am expelled for defending myself. Defending yourself? Ji-woo looked at him with genuine curiosity. Is self-defense not permitted at this academy? I reviewed all student conduct regulations and found no restrictions on responding to physical aggression with proportional force. Your response was proportional? Vex initiated physical contact with intent to cause harm or humiliation. I ended the threat with minimal damage to his person and no disruption to Academy property. By Deathworld standards, this was an extremely restrained response. Professor Thane realized he was looking at a completely different type of being than he had previously understood. The quiet, studious human was not weak or passive. She was a supremely controlled predator who had been carefully managing her own lethal capabilities for months. What would an unrestrained response have looked like? Ji-woo packed the last of her materials and stood to leave. You would need to clean blood from the auditorium walls and find a new student to fill Vex's position in the class. She paused at the auditorium door and looked back at Professor Thane with something that might have been sympathy. Professor, I should clarify something about Earth's Deathworld classification. We are not labeled as dangerous because we are violent. We are dangerous because we are adaptive. Every human child grows up in an environment where everything, plants, animals, weather, even microscopic organisms, is actively trying to kill us. And how do you survive such conditions? We learn to be more dangerous than everything else. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Professor Thane alone in the silent auditorium to contemplate exactly what kind of student his academy had unknowingly accepted. 3 months later, the advanced xenobiology classroom looked very different. Students from 47 species sat in carefully arranged groups, discussing adaptation mechanisms with new understanding and respect. The atmosphere had changed, from competitive hierarchy to collaborative learning. Ji-woo sat in the same seat she had occupied since her first day, taking notes with the same quiet attention she had always shown. But now, other students frequently looked to her for insights during discussions. When conflicts arose, they instinctively sought her perspective on resolution methods. Professor Thane was teaching a new section on Deathworld psychology, using Ji-woo's research as the foundation for understanding survival adaptation mechanisms. The key difference between Deathworld and Safe-World psychology, he explained, is threat assessment methodology. Safe-world species develop intelligence to build and maintain cooperative societies. Deathworld species develop intelligence to identify and neutralize threats before they become fatal. A student from the Avian Republic raised a wing. But that would make Deathworld species naturally violent, would it not? An understandable assumption, but incorrect, Professor Thane replied. Ji-woo, would you explain the distinction? Ji-woo looked up from her notes. Over the past months, she had become more comfortable speaking in class, though she still chose her words carefully. Violence and threat neutralization are different concepts, she began. Violence implies emotional response and unnecessary destruction. Threat neutralization is simply problem-solving applied to survival situations. She stood and moved to the presentation area, a significant change from her previous behavior. Consider a predator approaching your food source. A violent response would be to attack the predator aggressively, potentially causing injury to both parties and attracting other predators. An efficient response would be to neutralize the specific threat with minimal energy expenditure and no unnecessary harm. Like what you did to Vex? Asked a student from the synthetic collective. Exactly. Vex became a threat to my ability to continue my education. I neutralized that threat, using the minimum force necessary while avoiding permanent damage that would create additional complications. The classroom fell silent as students processed this explanation. They were beginning to understand that what they had interpreted as terrifying violence was actually an example of remarkably restrained problem-solving. This is why Deathworld species appear dangerous to safe-world species, Jiwoo continued. We automatically calculate threat responses for every situation, even when we have no intention of using violence. You see this as hostile behavior, but for us, it is simply environmental awareness. After class, groups of students often approached Jiwoo with questions about survival psychology, adaptation mechanisms, and conflict resolution. She had become an unofficial consultant for students from species who had never needed to consider serious threats to their survival. Quinn, her former group partner, was among her most frequent visitors. The aquatic being had developed genuine respect for Jiwoo's analytical abilities. "I have been thinking about our group project," Quinn said as they walked through the station's Central Park area. "You knew from the beginning how Vex would behave, did you not?" His behavior followed predictable patterns based on Helion's social psychology and individual personality assessment. He responded to perceived challenges to his status exactly as his species conditioning would suggest. You could have stopped his harassment at any time. Yes, but early intervention would have taught me less about Academy social dynamics. I learned more from observing the complete behavioral cycle. Quinn made thoughtful clicking sounds. You used yourself as bait to study how bullying behavior develops and escalates. I used myself as a research subject in a comprehensive behavioral study. The personal cost was acceptable given the educational value. This was typical of Jiwoo's approach to every aspect of Academy life. She had transformed what others saw as victimization into valuable research data, analyzing her own experiences with the same scientific detachment she applied to everything else. The consulting position had developed into something more significant than anyone had expected. Jiwoo's behavioral analysis methods were being adopted by Academy counselors to help students from different species understand each other better. Her threat assessment techniques were being taught to security personnel. Her conflict resolution protocols had reduced interspecies tensions throughout the station. Director Keith had offered her a permanent research position after graduation, leading the Academy's new Department of Interspecies Psychology. Your research has fundamentally changed how we understand cross-species interaction, he had told her during their meeting. We would like you to establish formal protocols for integrating students from hostile environment worlds. Jiwoo had accepted the position, though she noted that it would require her to interact with students more directly than she preferred. I will need to modify my observation methods if I become an active participant in social structures. You have been an active participant all along, Director Keth had replied with something that might have been amusement. You simply chose to participate in ways that others did not recognize. The most significant change had been in her relationship with Vex himself. 2 weeks after the incident, he had requested a private meeting. Jiwoo had agreed, curious about his psychological recovery process. They met in one of the Academy's small conference rooms. Vex entered, looking subdued, his usual confident posture replaced by careful, respectful movements. He sat across from Jiwoo and was quiet for several minutes before speaking. I owe you an apology, he finally said. For what specifically? For treating you as inferior, for sabotaging your work, for trying to have you expelled, for... He paused, for forcing you to demonstrate capabilities that you clearly preferred to keep private. Jiwoo considered his words. Your behavior was consistent with your species' psychology and social conditioning. You responded to perceived status threats according to Helion cultural programming. That does not excuse it. No, but it explains it. Understanding the cause of behavior is the first step toward modifying future responses. Vex looked directly at her for the first time since entering the room. You knew I would eventually escalate to physical aggression. The probability was high. Helions have difficulty accepting social defeat and tend to respond with increasingly desperate measures when their authority is questioned. You could have warned me? Would you have listened? Vex thought about this honestly. No, I would have seen it as further proof of your arrogance. Then warning you would have served no purpose except to accelerate the conflict timeline. They sat in silence for a moment. Vex struggled with concepts that challenged everything he had been taught about social hierarchies and personal worth. What I do not understand, he said finally, is why you did not kill me. You had every justification after months of harassment. Academy regulations would have supported your actions as legitimate self-defense. Jiwoo tilted her head slightly. Would killing you have improved my educational experience? What? I came here to learn about different species and complete my academic requirements. How would your death have advanced those goals? It would have established your dominance. Other students would have respected your power. I do not require dominance or respect based on fear. I require access to information and learning opportunities. Your death would have created emotional trauma for other students, administrative complications for the academy, and legal difficulties that would have interfered with my studies. Vex realized she was completely serious. Her decision to spare. His life had been based entirely on practical considerations, not mercy or moral principles. You truly do not think like other species, he said with something approaching awe. Deathworld psychology prioritizes survival and goal achievement over social positioning. Killing unnecessarily wastes energy and creates additional threats. Additional threats? Your family would have demanded investigation and possibly revenge. Other Helion students would have become hostile. Academy security would have monitored me more closely. All of these complications would have interfered with my primary objective, which was learning how to live successfully among non-Deathworld species. Vex left that meeting with a completely transformed understanding of what had happened to him. He had not been defeated by a superior warrior. He had been efficiently managed by someone who viewed him as an obstacle to be minimized rather than an enemy to be conquered. Over the following months, he had become one of Jiwoo's most dedicated students in her informal lessons on interspecies psychology. His family's political connections proved useful for implementing her conflict resolution protocols across multiple star systems. Now, as the semester neared its end, Jiwoo reflected on how much had changed. The academy that had once seemed like a hostile environment filled with potential threats had become a comfortable research facility where she could study and learn in peace. Students no longer whispered about the broken human. Instead, they discussed the silent professor with respect and genuine interest. Her methods had been adopted by counselors, security personnel, and even 3 months later, the advanced xenobiology classroom looked very different. Students from 47 species sat in carefully arranged groups, discussing adaptation mechanisms with new understanding and respect. The atmosphere had changed, from competitive hierarchy to collaborative learning. Jiwoo sat in the same seat she had occupied since her first day, taking notes with the same quiet attention she had always shown. But now, other students frequently looked to her for insights during discussions. When conflicts arose, they instinctively sought her perspective on resolution methods. Professor Thane was teaching a new section on Deathworld psychology, using Jiwoo's research as the foundation for understanding survival adaptation mechanisms. The key difference between Deathworld and Safe World psychology, he explained, is threat assessment methodology. Safe World species develop intelligence to build and maintain cooperative societies. Deathworld species develop intelligence to identify and neutralize threats before they become fatal. A student from the Avian Republic raised a wing. But that would make Deathworld species naturally violent, would it not? An understandable assumption, but incorrect, Professor Thane replied. Jiwoo, would you explain the distinction? Jiwoo looked up from her notes. Over the past months, she had become more comfortable speaking in class, though she still chose her words carefully. Violence and threat neutralization are different concepts, she began. Violence implies emotional response and unnecessary destruction. Threat neutralization is simply problem-solving applied to survival situations. She stood and moved to the presentation area, a significant change from her previous behavior. Consider a predator approaching your food source. A violent response would be to attack the predator aggressively, potentially causing injury to both parties and attracting other predators. An efficient response would be to neutralize the specific threat with minimal energy expenditure and no unnecessary harm. Like what you did to Vex? Asked a student from the Synthetic Collective. Exactly. Vex became a threat to my ability to continue my education. I neutralized that threat using the minimum force necessary while avoiding permanent damage that would create additional complications. The classroom fell silent as students processed this explanation. They were beginning to understand that what they had interpreted as terrifying violence was actually an example of remarkably restrained problem-solving. This is why Deathworld species appear dangerous to Safe World species. Jiwoo continued. We automatically calculate threat responses for every situation, even when we have no intention of using violence. You see this as hostile behavior, but for us, it is simply environmental awareness. After class, groups of students often approached Jiwoo with questions about survival psychology, adaptation mechanisms, and conflict resolution. She had become an unofficial consultant for students from species who had never needed to consider serious threats to their survival. Quinn, her former group partner, was among her most frequent visitors. The aquatic being had developed genuine respect for Jiwoo's analytical abilities. I have been thinking about our group project, Quinn said as they walked through the station's Central Park area. You knew from the beginning how Vex would behave, did you not? His behavior followed predictable patterns based on Helian social psychology and individual personality assessment. He responded to perceived challenges to his status exactly as his species conditioning would suggest. You could have stopped his harassment at any time. Yes, but early intervention would have taught me less about academy social dynamics. I learned more from observing the complete behavioral cycle. Quinn made thoughtful clicking sounds. You used yourself as bait to study how bullying behavior develops and escalates. I used myself as a research subject in a comprehensive behavioral study. The personal cost was acceptable given the educational value. This was typical of Jiwoo's approach to every aspect of academy life. She had transformed what others saw as victimization into valuable research data, analyzing her own experiences with the same scientific detachment she applied to everything else. The consulting position had developed into something more significant than anyone had expected. Jiwoo's behavioral analysis methods were being adopted by academy counselors to help students from different species understand each other better. Her threat assessment techniques were being taught to security personnel. Her conflict resolution protocols had reduced interspecies tensions throughout the station. Director Keth had offered her a permanent research position after graduation, leading the Academy's new Department of Interspecies Psychology. Your research has fundamentally changed how we understand cross-species interaction, he had told her during their meeting. We would like you to establish formal protocols for integrating students from hostile environment worlds. Jiwoo had accepted the position, though she noted that it would require her to interact with students more directly than she preferred. I will need to modify my observation methods if I become an active participant in social structures. You have been an active participant all along, Director Keth had replied with something that might have been amusement. You simply chose to participate in ways that others did not recognize. The most significant change had been in her relationship with Vex himself. 2 weeks after the incident, he had requested a private meeting. Jiwoo had agreed, curious about his psychological recovery process. They met in one of the Academy's small conference rooms. Vex entered looking subdued, his usual confident posture replaced by careful, respectful movements. He sat across from Jiwoo and was quiet for several minutes before speaking. I owe you an apology, he finally said. For what specifically? For treating you as inferior, for sabotaging your work, for trying to have you expelled, for... He paused. For forcing you to demonstrate capabilities that you clearly preferred to keep private. Jiwoo considered his words. Your behavior was consistent with your species' psychology and social conditioning. You responded to perceived status threats according to Helion cultural programming. That does not excuse it. No, but it explains it. Understanding the cause of behavior is the first step toward modifying future responses. Vex looked directly at her for the first time since entering the room. You knew I would eventually escalate to physical aggression. The probability was high. Helions have difficulty accepting social defeat and tend to respond with increasingly desperate measures when their authority is questioned. You could have warned me. Would you have listened? Vex thought about this honestly. No, I would have seen it as further proof of your arrogance. Then warning, you would have served no purpose except to accelerate the conflict timeline. They sat in silence for a moment. Vex struggled with concepts that challenged everything he had been taught about social hierarchies and personal worth. What I do not understand, he said finally, is why you did not kill me. You had every justification after months of harassment. Academy regulations would have supported your actions as legitimate self-defense. Jiwoo tilted her head slightly. Would killing you have improved my educational experience? What? I came here to learn about different species and complete my academic requirements. How would your death have advanced those goals? It would have established your dominance. Other students would have respected your power. I do not require dominance or respect based on fear. I require access to information and learning opportunities. Your death would have created emotional trauma for other students, administrative complications for the academy, and legal difficulties that would have interfered with my studies. Vex realized she was completely serious. Her decision to spare his life had been based entirely on practical considerations, not mercy or moral principles. You truly do not think like other species, he said with something approaching awe. Deathworld psychology prioritizes survival and goal achievement over social positioning. Killing unnecessarily wastes energy and creates additional threats. Additional threats? Your family would have demanded investigation and possibly revenge. Other Helian students would have become hostile. Academy security would have monitored me more closely. All of these complications would have interfered with my primary objective, which was learning how to live successfully among non-Deathworld species. Vex left that meeting with a completely transformed understanding of what had happened to him. He had not been defeated by a superior warrior. He had been efficiently managed by someone who viewed him as an obstacle to be minimized rather than an enemy to be conquered. Over the following months, he had become one of Ji-Woo's most dedicated students in her informal lessons on interspecies psychology. His family's political connections proved useful for implementing her conflict resolution protocols across multiple star systems. Now, as the semester neared its end, Ji-Woo reflected on how much had changed. The academy that had once seemed like a hostile environment filled with potential threats had become a comfortable research facility where she could study and learn in peace. Students no longer whispered about the broken human. Instead, they discussed the silent professor with respect and genuine interest. Her methods had been adopted by counselors, security personnel, and even